Welcome back to Book by Book. We have been walking through the book of Isaiah for the last 3 weeks, and I would call it a walk as we've been making steady progress through the first 12 chapters of Isaiah. Well, this morning we're going to go more from a walk to a run, as we're going to cover Isaiah chapter 13 through 23. So we're going to run through 11 chapters and 189 verses of Isaiah. And once you see the material that we're covering, you're going to be glad that we went through it as quickly as we are. Isaiah 13 through 23 can be called the oracles against the nation, as Isaiah will go one by one looking at Judah and all of her neighbors, and in each one he will pronounce judgment against them. So we'll talk first about the nations that God is speaking against, and then we'll look at why. And then at the end, we are going to conclude by zeroing in on one of these prophecies for a couple of particular reasons that we'll get to at that time. The oracles against the nations were written against the following kingdoms. In Isaiah 13 and 14, we have Babylon. In Isaiah chapters 15 and 16, we have the nation of Moab. In Isaiah 17, 1 through 3, it is against Damascus. And we need to remember that whenever Damascus comes up, that is the capital of either Syria or Aram, both the same location. So Damascus is a judgment against Syria or Aram. And then we have Ephraim, which is brought up in Isaiah 17, 4 through 14. Ephraim is Israel. And if you remember, in this time period of Isaiah's life, Ephraim or Israel was aligned with Damascus or Syria. So it makes sense that in the same chapter, Isaiah is going to level judgment against both of those nations. And then next we have Egypt. Egypt, who ties with Babylon as receiving the longest denunciations against that nation. The land of the whirring wings, which lies beyond the river of Cush in Isaiah chapter 18, is written as a picture of the dynasty that is ruling over Egypt during that time period. And now we've already made it to Isaiah chapter 21. I told you we are running in this study, going all the way through Isaiah 13 to 21 already. Isaiah 21 takes us back to the nation of Babylon. The chapter itself never actually singles out Babylon in Isaiah 21, 1 through 10, but the language that's given most likely speaks to the people of Babylon during the heyday of the Assyrian Empire. Edom then comes up in judgment in easily the shortest of all the judgment passages in Isaiah 13 through 23, as Edom only gets 2 verses, Isaiah 21 verses 11 and 12. Next we have the people of the Arabia. So the Arabians, the ancient Arabs, are spoken against in Isaiah 21 verses 13 through 17. And then finally in Isaiah 22, we have Isaiah looking at his own people with a prophecy of judgment that is titled the Valley of Vision. The Valley of Vision describes an attack on Judah and Jerusalem, the suffering that will occur during the attack on God's people. And it appears that this is most likely, although we can't say 100% for sure because Isaiah doesn't give us enough details to be completely confident, but it looks like Isaiah 22, the Valley of Vision, is a prophecy of an event that will occur several chapters later in the book of Isaiah. And that event is when Sennacherib attacks the nation of Judah in 701 BC. There's a few small issues that scholars bring up, but I think most likely Isaiah chapter 22 is a prophecy that is predicting the events that will take place later in Isaiah chapters 36 and 37, and we'll look at them at that time period. Finally, Isaiah chapter 23, our final chapter in the section on the oracles against the nation, is a judgment on Tyre. So Isaiah gives all of these denunciations, all of these judgments, and they are specifically given against the nations of Babylon, Moab, Syria, Israel, Egypt, Edom, the Arabians, and Tyre. And then there's a special separate vision that is pointed toward Judah. And maybe you're wondering, maybe you don't care at all, but what is the significance of these nations? Why does Isaiah choose to single out all of these nations for a prophecy of judgment? But notice who is left out of this section. The people that you would assume should definitely get the judgment predicted against them. And that is the Assyrians. The Assyrians were the biggest, baddest, most depraved, and evil people on earth. It will be the Assyrians who will destroy Israel. It will be the Assyrians who will take over multiple cities of Judah and hem in Hezekiah and the remaining Jewish people into the city of Jerusalem. So why leave out Assyria, who you think would come first, and instead pick all of these other nations? And here's where we get one of those fascinating moments where we look at the information the Bible has for us. We examine it with the history of other nations that we're aware of during that period of time, and we see this amazing blending together to show us that what the Bible is giving us is genuine, factual evidence. Well, we've discovered in a study of the ancient writings of Assyria during that time period that there was a coalition of nations who gathered together to fight against and oppose the Assyrians. And you might be able to guess who are the nations who were in the coalition against Assyria. It was Babylon, Moab, Syria, Israel, Egypt, Edom, the Arabians, and Tyre. The exact nations that Isaiah lists in the oracles of the nation. So why does Isaiah speak judgment against them? I believe the purpose of this is to say, you can all align together. You can all team up, all of the smaller nations in the world, and hope to overcome the judgment that God is bringing against you by the hands of the Assyrians. But even if you all band together, you still cannot overthrow the plans of the Lord. They will not be able to escape God on their own. Even Judah, who will eventually escape thanks to Hezekiah throwing himself before Yahweh in prayer in one of the greatest stories in all of Scripture that is so often overlooked, even though it's told 3 different times in the Old Testament. Even Judah will find pain and affliction at the hands of Assyria, exactly how it's prophesied in Isaiah chapter 22. The oracles against the nation. And again, this is one of the reasons we're going through this, because this is truth that you can't see by looking at the individual trees, by going verse by verse. It's where you have to step back and look at the section as a whole. And when we look at the entire forest, the oracles against the nation, going through those 11 chapters in breakneck speed, what we see is God prophesying a single message to all of these nations. You cannot save yourself from my judgment. Make all the plans you want. Join together with as big of a coalition as you can muster, and you will fail. You will fall against the judgment of the Lord. I think this is also a great reminder for the church today as well. When we look at people who believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ for salvation alone, and also believe that you should live according to the standards of the Scripture, that group appears to be getting smaller and smaller. That we're a forgotten minority in the world. And so a lot of people are saying, let's join with others. Well, let's get in with people who might deny this part of the Bible, deny the right way of saving faith, so that we can coalesce along a bigger federation, a bigger coalition of Christians. And when we all band together to either change politics or to have giant revivals, then we'll see God work in miraculous ways. What God is saying here is, I don't care how many people you band together. The key is not what other people you're going to place your trust in, what other nations you're going to depend upon, but the key is, what God are you going to trust in? Who is the Lord that you are going to rest upon? The oracles against the nation is not a mindless rush to judgment by the Lord, given against people who just happen not to be his chosen people. But this is a call to trust in the Lord instead of trusting in ourselves. To trust in God's plan for salvation and not look at how big our church size is, how big our denomination is, and say, oh, look, we're doing great things because we've brought together so many different people. So I hope you can remember this the next time you're reading through the Bible in a year, not to just speed through this section and get past these judgments as quickly as you can, but remember the purpose of the oracles against the nations. So now that is Isaiah 13 through 23 in an overview, and at this point I want to narrow in on a specific chapter. The reason I picked this chapter as the one to narrow in on this section is because, one, it is a chapter that has been misinterpreted far too often over the last 500 years, and also it serves as a very good representation of what we're going to see throughout the entire section. And the chapter that we want to narrow in on is Isaiah 14. So again, remember the context of Isaiah 14. Isaiah 14 is in the midst of a section that is all about judgment against the countries who are present in Isaiah's day and who are all aligning themselves against the empire of Assyria. And Isaiah 13 and Isaiah 14 is one section of this 11-chapter section. And this is directed at the people of Babylon who think, I can escape God's judgment if I line up with them and them and them. So let's see specifically the beginning of Isaiah 14 in verses 1 through 4. When the Lord will have compassion on Jacob, and again choose Israel, and settle them in their own lands, then strangers will join them and attach themselves to the house of Jacob. The peoples will take them along and bring them to their place. And the house of Israel will possess them as an inheritance in the land of the Lord, as male servants and female servants, and they will take their captors captive and will rule over their oppressors. And it will be in the day when the Lord gives you rest from your pain and turmoil and harsh service in which you have been enslaved, that you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon and say, how the oppressor has ceased, and how fury has ceased. The first thing I want to point out is the time period of when this particular judgment on Babylon will take place. It will be, as Isaiah says, not fulfilled during these contemporary days with Assyria. But he lets them know at the very beginning when this will be fulfilled. And it will be at the time period when Judah has been taken out into captivity and then brought back to their land. It's the time period when they will have rest from their enslavement. And in those days, after they've returned from exile, this taunt will be spoken against Babylon. Now, looking at biblical history, we know when Judah, went into judgment. Went into exile, They went into exile when Nebuchadnezzar came in and through a couple of different attacks on Judah and Jerusalem, ended up defeating the nation, defeating the city, and bringing people back to Babylon. The most famous of those who went into exile was the prophet Daniel. And after that 70 years that are in captivity, the Jews will end up going back to their homeland. They will return from exile. They will return from their land of enslavement, which is exactly what Isaiah is prophesying at the beginning of Isaiah chapter 14. So when did Judah return from their captivity? When did they return from their enslavement? Well, we know specifically what year that occurred. That was the year 539. In the year 539, the Persian Emperor Cyrus made a decree, he made an edict that the Jews are to return to Jerusalem. Isaiah will later predict that it will be Cyrus who will send the Jews back in Isaiah 44 and 45. Now, the reason that I'm kind of walking through this time period, that this taunt is looking forward to the year 539 BC, is that there are a lot of scholars who want to say Isaiah is two different books. You have the first half of Isaiah, which is all about Assyria and their conquest over the land and judgments against Assyria's contemporaries. And then you have the second half of the book, which is all about, focused on Babylon and events that will take place in the future. Well, when does Isaiah 14 look forward to but Babylon and those events of the future? So what we see actually from Isaiah 14 is that the first half of Isaiah and the second half of Isaiah gel together really nice. So good that you can think both halves of Isaiah are written by the same author. The same man made the prophecies in the first half of Isaiah that made them in the second half of the book. The other interesting thing is that Isaiah 14 is a prophecy talking about how when will people be able to taunt Babylon? They'll be able to do it when the Jews are sent back to the land of Jerusalem. So we know that'll take place in the year 539. And here's the really cool thing. A lot of people in the church don't know this because it's not something that's touted and talked about as much as the 539 date. And that is the year of the fall of the nation of Babylon. The fall of Babylon took place at a specific battle. A specific battle when Emperor Cyrus conquered the Babylonian. That battle is called the Battle of Opis. You can look it up online and read about it if you'd like to. But when do you think the Battle of Opis took place? None other than the year 539. And so Isaiah, and this is just so cool. This is awesome stuff. In Isaiah 14, 1 through 4, which takes place, that prophecy has taken place, well over 100 years before the year 539, Isaiah prophesies, there'll come a day when we will all be able to taunt the Babylonians, when we will be able to taunt the ruler of the Babylonians. And when will we be able to taunt them? We'll be able to do it at the time period when the Jews are released from their captivity and enslavement. So what happens all those years later? In the same exact year that Cyrus sends the Jews away from their captivity, Cyrus also conquers the Babylonians. So everybody who is not currently being defeated by the Persians are in a position to taunt the Babylonians. This is an amazing prophetic fulfillment. It is one that should be talked about more often, and it is also one of these ones that shows us, God takes time fulfilling His word, and that's fine. It doesn't mean that He still will not fulfill. It doesn't mean He's not going to fulfill it. It just means that God does things on His own time and His own calendar. So Isaiah chapter 14 is a prophecy that is specifically directed to mock, I would say not specifically the king of Babylon who lived in the year 539, but I think this is probably more directed toward all the kings of Babylon who would end up becoming boastful and prideful and think that they were the greatest man in the entire world. And so Isaiah is mocking the kings of Babylon, and you could say specifically mocking the king of Babylon in 539. And so what does Isaiah say against those kings or king of Babylon? Well, it's a long section in verses 5 through 21, but I want you to listen through me. And the reason that I'm reading this whole section, Isaiah 14, 5 through 21, is that this is a singular poem. All of this is one poetic structure with no break in the Hebrew that we have one section here and one section there. So Isaiah 14, 5 through 21 says, "The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of rulers." So we know that that is Babylon, based on the king of Babylon, based on verses 1 through 4, "which used to strike the peoples in fury with unceasing strokes, which subdued the nations in anger with unrestrained persecution. The whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into shouts of joy. Even the cypress trees rejoice over you, and the cedars of Lebanon, saying, since you were laid low, no tree cutter comes against us. Sheol from beneath is excited over you to meet you when you come. It arouses for you the spirits of the dead, all the leaders of the earth. It raises all the kings of the nations from their thrones. They will all respond and say to you, even you have been made weak as we. You have become like us. Your pomp and the music of your harps have been brought down to Sheol. Maggots are spread out as your bed beneath you, and worms are your covering. How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, O son of the dawn. You have been cut down to the earth, you who have weakened the nations. But you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mount of the assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Nevertheless, you will be thrust down to Sheol, to the recesses of the pit. Those who see you will gaze at you. They will ponder over you, saying, is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world like a wilderness and overthrew its cities, who will not allow his prisoners to go home? All the kings of the nations lie in glory, each in his own tomb. But you have been cast out of your tomb, like a rejected branch, clothed with the slain who are pierced with a sword, who go down to the stones of the pit like a trampled corpse. You will not be united with them in burial, because you have ruined your country, you have slain your people. May the offspring of evildoers not be mentioned forever. Prepare for his sons a place of slaughter, because of the iniquity of their fathers. They must not arise and take possession of the earth and fill the face of the world with cities. So like I said, I read the whole thing for a specific reason, and that is this is one whole poem. All of Isaiah 14, verses 5 through 21, points to the king or the kings of a single nation, and that is the kingdom of Babylon. So the poem is directed at the king of Babylon, to those ancient kings, and we can even point to the date of when the events of Isaiah 14, 5 through 21 will take place. We know the year 539 BC. So this is all about judgment on the nations who would oppose Assyria during the days of Isaiah and the eventual downfall of Babylon. I say this because when we come to the most famous passage of Isaiah 14, verses 12 through 14, how have you fallen from heaven, O star of the morning? Or more famously, the Latin translation of that, Lucifer. Son of the dawn, you have been cut down to the earth, you have weakened the nations. But you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. All of the verses surrounding verses 12 through 14, the entire context of Isaiah chapter 14 is all about the king of Babylon. And we look at the whole section. What kind of person is described? Is it an angelic being who has lived with God since the foundations of the earth? Is it a demon who has opposed God for hundreds of years? No. It's a man whose body will be covered in maggots. It's a king who had sons. It's a king whose body was thrown away from his tomb. It's someone who will go down to Sheol, the place of the dead, and be mocked by other kings whom he first dispossessed because he has died in the same way they died. Based upon all of Isaiah 14, verses 12 through 14 cannot refer to Satan. And there's also nothing in these verses in particular that forces us to say, these have got to be Satan. We know from Nebuchadnezzar what we see of him in the book of Daniel. We know from the pharaohs and how they viewed themselves in Egypt that these kings, these emperors, saw themselves as gods. They saw themselves as people to be worshiped, people who could ascend to the thrones of heaven. The language that's in Isaiah 14, 12 through 14 is not too lofty for an ancient Babylonian empire. They would make these claims. Now, we may read this and say, I couldn't imagine any human ruler saying this. Well, back in the time period of Isaiah, they did. And there are some rulers today who still make claims like this. One time I watched a documentary on North Korea. The documentary followed an ophthalmologist who traveled to North Korea to do some very basic LASIK surgery on several people in North Korea who were blind. Surgery that is ridiculously common in North Korea. It costs as little as $2,000 to get it done with both eyes. And if you have a serious enough condition, you can go from being blind to being able to see by this really quick LASIK operation. Well, this doctor performed this surgery on a classroom filled with blind individuals. And after the surgery was over, the people who had been operated on and who were blind and now could see were taken into another room. And in that second room, there was a picture hanging on the wall of the, at that time, North Korean dictator Kim Jong-il. And every person who had the operation and can now see went up to that picture and bowed down before it. And they praised and worshiped Kim Jong-il because their great leader had given them the miracle of restoring their sight. Emperors throughout human history have saw themselves as morning stars, as gods. And few emperors were more proud than the Babylonians. So when it comes to passages like this, and this is just important for how we interpret the Bible as a whole, we need to take bad exegesis, looking at passages and interpretations outside of context, and throw them away. Satan does not show up in Isaiah 14. It doesn't fit. It doesn't make a lot of sense, because if you're going to put Satan there, you got to say he has kids, he has a body, he's going to die like any other man. And this is a section on the oracles against the nations of Isaiah's day. Now, I say all that to say the next time you read through Isaiah 13 through 23, I hope that your mind will be able to engage a little bit more with what you're reading. You'll be able to understand it better as you walk through your Bible, and specifically as you walk through Isaiah, book by book, chapter by chapter.